Welcome to the deep dive. You know, you look around today at a world that is just completely swept by conflict.
Oh, absolutely everywhere.
Right. You see these geopolitical wars breaking out. You see extreme wealth gaps just tearing societies apart. And like you feel this suffocating modern anxiety literally everywhere you go.
Yeah, it's heavy.
But what if the ultimate historical loop is playing out right in front of your eyes? Like, what if the absolute peak of a nation's prosperity is exactly the moment its deadly collapse begins?
It is a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it is completely counterintuitive, right?
Right.
We are conditioned from childhood to believe that collapse comes from weakness.
Exactly. We think collapse comes from poverty. Like, we think it comes from the outside.
Right. We picture barbarian hordes breaking down the gates of some starving, desperate city. You picture a nation on its last legs finally just giving out.
But the reality is far more sinister. So to answer this massive question, we are doing a huge deep dive today into this epic masterwork of history. We are cracking open The Search for Modern China by Jonathan D. Spence.
Oh, a total classic.
Yeah, he was this late legendary Yale historian, and he basically dedicated his entire life to piercing through the fog of history.
Spence was he was an absolute master of his craft. He didn't just look at timelines. He looked at the underlying operational logic of China's 400-year struggle with modernity. Like, he wanted to know the exact mechanisms of collapse. He wanted to find the real reasons things fall apart.
And we are going to use his empathetic but coldly data-driven analysis to do exactly that today for you. So let's just drop the first massive contradiction right now.
Let's do it.
Everyone thinks empires are destroyed by outside invaders, but here is where it gets really interesting.
The fatal noose is almost always tied around the empire's neck when everyone is, too busy celebrating its golden age.
It is the ultimate paradox, like prosperity masking a terminal disease.
Yeah, to truly grasp this, we have to rewind. We cannot look at the end. We have to look at the twilight of an empire when the sun is still shining the absolute brightest. We need to go back to the year 1600.
The late Ming Dynasty. So why is the most prosperous era actually the starting point of a total collapse? I want to set the scene for you here, because the scale is just mind-blowing. In 1600, China's population was over 120 million people.
That is a staggering number for the 17th century.
Right. It totally dwarfed the combined populations of all European nations. All of them put together. Spain, England, France, the Holy Roman Empire.
It's wild.
Combine them all and they don't even come close to the Ming Dynasty.
The scale is almost unimaginable for that time period. Like, think about what was happening elsewhere. Russia was just barely forming a unified state out of a frozen wilderness.
India was heavily divided. The ancient, glorious empires of Mexico and Peru were already utterly destroyed by European diseases and Spanish steel.
Yeah. And then you have China, standing alone as this absolute monolith of human civilization.
The Forbidden City in Beijing was magnificent. I want you to just picture it. It was a massive machine built of marble and gold. Giant, imposing archways. Deep, endless courtyards.
Thousands of officials.
Yeah, thousands moving in perfect synchronicity.
It was a bureaucracy that, in theory, managed the daily lives of over 100 million people across a landmass the size of Europe. And they did this without electricity.
Right.
Without the telegraph, without steam trains. It was an administrative marvel. It was the absolute peak of human organization.
But the empire was already doomed.
Completely. It looked utterly invincible. But within 50 short years, that entire system would completely collapse.
Gone. Smashed to pieces in a wave of blood and fire. So, I am stuck on this point. What does this actually mean for a modern state? Like, when did China actually become modern? If they were so advanced back then, why did the whole thing shatter?
That is the million-dollar question. And this brings us to how Jonathan Spence actually approaches this mystery. How does an Englishman living in America pierce through 400 years of massive, complex Chinese struggles?
Spence was entirely unique. Like, he didn't just write from dusty archives, calculating grain yields in a vacuum. He wrote from the heart.
He really did. He threw away rigid Western theories. He actively refused to force Chinese history into a neat, tidy European mold. He wasn't looking for a European-style Renaissance.
Or an Enlightenment.
Exactly. No European-style Enlightenment. He looked at China from the inside out. He used profound empathy, but he anchored that empathy with hard, cold, unforgiving data.
And he drops this absolute face slap of a conclusion early on. It makes everyone squirm in their seats, both in the East and the West.
Oh, it really does. Because it challenges everything we assume about human progress. Spence concludes this. By the year 1600, China already possessed the sprouts of a modern state.
The ingredients were entirely there. Think about what makes a state modern. You need standardized administrative structures.
Okay.
They had it. You need vast integrated commercial networks.
They had it.
You need a meritocratic civil service. They had the imperial examination system.
But here's the agonizing punchline. Throughout the subsequent 400 years of searching, it never fully became one.
Wait, even by the late 20th century?
Even by the late 20th century. 4 centuries of agonizing struggle. Endless bloody revolutions. Tens of millions of lives lost. And the search for modernity remained painfully unfinished.
That is absolutely chilling to me. Like, to have the blueprint right there on the table but never finish the building. Why? What was fundamentally stopping them?
We have to look at the disease rotting the foundation from the inside.
Which is the danger of absolute control. The hollow disease behind the prosperity. Why does the ultimate centralization of imperial power lead directly to the death of a nation's vitality? Let's paint a picture of the late Ming Dynasty first.
On the surface, it is dazzling. It looks like a cultural utopia.
You have this vibrant, explosive cultural boom. You have brilliant essays being published and circulated. You have deeply emotional operas like Tang Xianzi's The Peony Pavilion.
Which is an absolute masterpiece.
Right.
And in 1598, it deals with incredibly complex, raw human emotions. Love, death, resurrection. It wasn't just rigid state propaganda. It was high art.
Yeah. And you have blockbuster populist novels like Journey to the West, Sun Wukong, The Monkey King, Rebelling Against Heaven. It looks like a massive cultural golden age.
Right. Women are increasingly becoming literate.
The publishing industry for short stories is just booming.
It feels exactly like a renaissance. The wealthy merchant class are living incredible, luxurious lives in beautiful garden estates. But it is an illusion.
Here comes the face slap.
The Ming Dynasty exercised extreme central control over religion, over philosophy, and most importantly, over its cities.
The emperor controlled absolutely everything.
Because of this extreme centralization, an independent, self-governing city was literally impossible. It did not exist.
There was no local autonomy. Like, think about that for a second. There is no local mayor answering to the local people. There is no city council elected by the merchants to fix the roads or manage a crisis.
Everything reported strictly up to the emperor. The central state dictated all the rules. The local magistrate was a stranger appointed by Beijing, not a local leader.
I want to use a modern analogy here. It is like a massive global corporation. Imagine a corporate headquarters that refuses to let a local store manager put out a trash can fire in the break room without first emailing the CEO for written permission.
That is exactly what it was like.
So when a real disaster actually hit, what happened?
Total, catastrophic paralysis. Because local society had zero autonomy, they could not react organically. They could not govern themselves during a crisis. They could not mobilize their own resources effectively.
They were just standing around waiting for orders from Beijing, orders that took weeks to arrive on horseback.
Exactly. When natural or man-made disasters struck, this massive, highly cultured, incredibly wealthy empire instantly became a mud-footed giant. It had zero institutional resistance.
It was completely hollow inside. The central government sucked all the oxygen out of the room. It monopolized all power, which meant it also monopolized all responsibility. When things went wrong, there was no local safety net.
And then the very first wave of globalization hit that fragile system, and it broke the giant's back.
Let's talk about that, the fatal silver arbitrage. Because this sounds totally crazy to me. Wealth usually builds empires. How did the very first wave of global wealth become the rope the empire used to hang itself?
This is a perfect, terrifying storm of global economics colliding with local climate.
Let's bring in the global connection, silver from the New World, from the massive mines in Mexico and Potosi in Peru.
Mined under brutal Spanish colonial control. The Spanish galleons were crossing the Pacific.
Right, and the silver flooded into China through Manila in the Philippines. Chinese merchants were trading massive amounts of high-quality silk, tea, and porcelain for this raw silver.
It was supposed to make China incomprehensibly rich. They were the factory of the world, sucking in the world's currency.
Instead, it created an absolute economic nightmare for the common person. And I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this. If silver is flooding into the country, shouldn't they be wealthy? How does more money equal a nightmare for the working class?
You have to look at the bimetallic currency system. It is all about the exchange rate. The traditional day-to-day economy for a peasant ran entirely on copper coins. You buy your food in copper, you sell your grain in copper.
But the Ming government demanded that land taxes be paid in pure silver.
Precisely. So when you flood a global market with silver, the value of that silver eventually starts to fluctuate wildly based on global supply chains that the emperor in Beijing cannot control.
So let's run a simulation. Imagine you are a Chinese farmer in the 1630s.
Here is the brutal, crushing math. In the early 1630s, 1,000 of your copper coins bought 1 ounce of silver. So you sell your harvest, you take 1,000 copper coins, you trade it for 1 ounce of silver, and you pay your tax.
But by 1640, global trade disruptions occur. The Spanish have trouble shipping the silver.
The supply dries up. The value of silver skyrockets inside China. Now, 1,000 copper coins only buys half an ounce of silver.
Oh, wow. And by 1643?
By 1643, 1,000 copper coins bought just 1/3 of an ounce of silver.
Think about what that actually means for a peasant. You are working the exact same land. You are selling the exact same amount of crops for the exact same amount of copper. But your taxes are due in silver. Your real tax burden just tripled without the government ever passing a law to raise the rate.
It crushed the working class into dust. The peasants were suddenly defaulting on their taxes, losing their land, and starving. And while the domestic economy was melting down, a massive military crisis erupted on the borders.
The Manchus were rising in the northeast. Fierce, organized warriors threatening the Great Wall. Border wars break out.
To fight those wars, the Ming needed money. Between 1618 and 1639, border defense costs caused agricultural taxes to multiply by at least 7 times.
7 times. And remember, the currency exchange rate is already destroying the peasants. They are being squeezed from both sides.
Then, nature delivers the final, unforgiving blow. The global phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age hits hard.
Severe, relentless droughts, plunging winter temperatures, crops are completely ruined. The vital growing season is shortened by a full 2 weeks. People are literally eating tree bark and dirt.
The government's tax system completely collapsed. They were broke. The peasants had nothing left to give. The court could not feed their soldiers. They could not pay their officials.
So sitting in the opulent Forbidden City, the central planners make a fatal accounting decision. To save money, the court cut funding to the rural postal relay stations.
It seems like a simple budget cut. Trimming the administrative fat, just lay off some low-level government workers.
But the single act fired a poor, frustrated postal worker in the impoverished Northwest. His name was Li Zicheng.
He was suddenly out of a job. He was hungry. He was incredibly angry. And he had military and organizational skills from running the postal routes.
Wait, a fired mailman? Are you serious?
I am totally serious. He raised a rebel army out of the starving peasants. And he marched on Beijing. She destroyed the Ming dynasty. A fired mailman burned down the greatest empire on earth.
Because the system was so fragile, so hollow, so utterly lacking in local resilience, one single budget cut in a time of crisis ignited a nationwide inferno.
The last Ming emperor walks up a hill behind the Forbidden City in 1644. He hangs himself on a tree. The empire falls.
And the Manchus, who were waiting at the borders, step right into the vacuum. They ride through the Great Wall and take control. But how do you instantly force hundreds of millions of Han Chinese people to accept a new foreign ruler overnight?
You attack their physical identity. The Qing dynasty begins, and they start with a brutal psychological shock doctrine.
Keep your hair and lose your head, or keep your head and lose your hair.
It was the ultimate, inescapable loyalty test.
The Manchus take Beijing in 1644. By 1645, the Manchu regent, a brilliant and ruthless leader named Dorgan, issues the terrifying Q order.
The Q. This meant shaving the entire front of the head bare and braiding the remaining hair in the back into a long, thick tail.
He issues a simple binary command to the entire male population of China. Execute anyone who disobeys within 10 days. 10 days to change your entire physical identity.
The psychological warfare here is astonishing, because at first, when the Manchus crossed the wall, they claimed they came merely to avenge the Ming emperor against the peasant rebels like Li Zicheng.
Right. They played the saviors, they said they were restoring order. Dorgan even briefly issued the haircut order, saw the panic, and withdrew it to calm the people down. He essentially said, never mind, keep your traditions, we're just here to help.
But a month later, once his armies had secured key cities, he ruthlessly forced it back into law.
I have to push back on this. Why? Why risk a massive bloody rebellion over a hairstyle? It seems so petty. You have the throne, you have the military. Why push people to the brink over hair?
Because it wasn't about fashion. It was a physical, bloody test of identity and forced loyalty. It was a visible sorting mechanism.
It was about breaking their spirit instantly.
Exactly. For Han Chinese men, traditional hair worn long and bound up was a core symbol of masculinity. It was a symbol of elegance. Most importantly, it was a symbol of Confucian filial piety. The philosophy explicitly taught that your body, your hair, and your skin are sacred gifts from your parents. You do not mutilate them.
To shave your head was a deep existential humiliation. It meant you completely submitted to the barbarian conqueror. It meant you rejected your ancestors.
I want you to really empathize with this. Imagine someone conquering your city tomorrow. The new regime announces that by next Friday, you must permanently scar or alter your face in a highly visible way to prove your loyalty.
God.
If you walk outside without that scar, you are executed on the spot. If your brother refuses, he is executed. What does that do to a nation's psyche?
It creates absolute trauma. This physical subjugation sparked fierce, unyielding resistance. Cities in the South fought to the bitter death over this. Horrific massacres occurred where hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered simply because they refused to shave their heads. It created a deep, simmering trauma that lasted for centuries.
It wasn't just a haircut. It was a brand on the body, a daily, physical reminder every time you looked in the mirror that you were a conquered subject.
And in the short term, it worked. It forged a new visual reality of the king state. Everyone looked like a subject, but the underlying rot in the imperial bureaucracy, that hollow disease, was still there. It didn't magically go away with a new dynasty.
Which takes us to the 1720s, Emperor Yongzheng. The empire is seemingly stable, but the internal corruption is absolutely legendary.
This is a wild story. Why did an emperor's anti-corruption storm force local elites into a violent rebellion? We usually think of rebellions as poor, starving peasants fighting rich, greedy kings.
But Emperor Yongzheng launches a massive financial reform specifically to stop his own officials from bleeding the peasants dry. He is actively trying to help the poor.
The tax system was totally rigged. Local officials were adding massive, illegal surcharges to the taxes they collected from the peasants. They called it meltage fees.
It was a brilliant, evil loophole. The officials claimed that when they collected broken bits of silver from the peasants and melted them down into standard ingots to send to Beijing, some silver was lost in the fire. So they charged a meltage fee to cover the loss.
But it was a total scam. The fee was astronomical. The officials were just pocketing the extra silver. So Emperor Yongzheng, who is a notorious workaholic and a hardliner, institutes a policy called returning the meltage fee to the public treasury.
He says, let's make this fee legal, let's standardize it at a low rate, and let's put it directly in the government bank. Then we will use that money to actually pay local officials a living wage so they stop stealing from the poor.
It is a totally rational, modern policy. He sends out ruthless auditors to check the books, and the pushback they found is staggering.
The auditors discovered that wealthy, elite landlords were entirely dodging taxes. The burden was falling 100% on the poorest farmers.
How are the rich pulling this off?
By hiding their massive, sprawling estates under hundreds of fake names, ghost accounts. They bribed the local clerks to alter the land registers.
It is the ultimate tax evasion. The rich pay nothing. The poor pay everything. It is like modern billionaires hiding their wealth in hundreds of offshore shell companies while the middle class pays income tax.
Here is the face slack. When Emperor Yongzheng cracked down to protect the poor and tax the rich, well, let's just say they didn't take it well.
The elite landlords didn't just complain. They didn't just write angry letters to the capital or hire lobbyists. They violently rebelled.
They incited riots among the very peasants they were exploiting.
They physically blocked the roads. They destroyed vital bridges to keep the imperial auditors out of their towns. Imagine modern billionaires violently rioting in the streets and blowing up highways to stop IRS auditors from checking their bank accounts.
It was a true, brutal clash between imperial power and local vested interests. The local elite proved they would literally burn their own towns to the ground before paying their fair share of taxes.
The system was structurally designed to protect the wealthy at the expense of both the central state and the poor. Even an absolute emperor, a dictator with the power of life and death, struggled to break that local network of corruption.
And this structural flaw collides directly with a terrifying demographic reality. This brings us to the population dividend, or rather, the population trap.
We move into the glorious Qianlong era in the 18th century. The population doubles. It is universally seen as the absolute peak of the Golden Age. The treasury is full. the borders are expanded. So why did the average person's survival hit absolute rock bottom during this golden age?
Let's look at the mechanics of this massive boom. It happened thanks to a long period of relative peace and, crucially, the introduction of New World crops.
Sweet potatoes and corn, these are miracle crops. They can grow in poor, sandy soil. They can grow on steep hillsides where rice cannot. They are incredibly calorie-dense.
Because of this new food supply, China's population absolutely explodes. It goes from around 150 million to over 300 million by the end of Emperor Qianlong's reign.
On paper, that sounds like a massive success story. More people, more food, more workers, a thriving civilization.
But you have to explain the math of doom.
The math is terrifying. While the population doubled, the amount of arable land only doubled.
The ratio of people to land was shrinking rapidly. You had twice as many mouths, but you couldn't invent twice as much fertile soil.
By the end of this period, the average northern farming family had a pathetic 2.5 acres of land to survive on.
And that is just the average. 25% of farmers had zero land. Absolutely nothing. They were desperate tenant farmers giving all their crops to a landlord, or they were drifters wandering the roads.
I look at this and I wonder, couldn't they innovate? Couldn't they build large-scale, efficient farming like we saw in the agricultural revolution in Britain? Why not consolidate the land, use new plows, and farm at scale?
No, they couldn't. And this is the trap. It comes down to the traditional Chinese equal inheritance system.
Every son gets an equal slice of the father's land?
Exactly. Contrast this with England, where the oldest son gets the entire estate, keeping the farm large and forcing the younger brothers to go to the city or join the navy. In China, every generation, the farm is divided equally among all the sons.
It's like having a single pizza. You invite two friends, you two get a big slice. But if they invite their friends and those friends invite their friends, eventually everyone is trying to survive on a microscopic crumb. So generation by generation, the farms get smaller and smaller and smaller.
They are sliced into microscopic, irrational plots.
Because of this, China couldn't accumulate large landlord capital. You couldn't build economies of scale. You couldn't afford to experiment with new farming machinery on a tiny half-acre plot.
They fell into an ultra-inefficient, labor-intensive trap. You have a tiny piece of land and lots of sons. You can't buy a machine. You just throw more human sweat at the dirt. You weed the soil by hand meticulously, inch by inch, day after day.
It is the ultimate definition of involution. Working harder and harder, expending massive amounts of energy just to stay exactly in the same miserable place. There is no technological breakthrough. There is just endless grinding human labor.
And the human cost of this involution is absolutely horrifying. Let's zoom in on what this actually looked like for a real family.
We have to look at the tragic life index of Doi village, because this shatters the illusion of the Golden Age completely.
The true lifespan of a commoner in this so-called Golden Age was barely 32 years.
Barely 32 years, in the middle of the greatest era of the Qing dynasty.
Barely 32.
Let's look at a specific case study that Spence and other historians have pulled from the archives. Doi village in South Manchuria.
When you look at the raw, brutal census data from the imperial archives, it is deeply sobering.
1/3 of male infants died before their first birthday.
1 in 3. Gone.
Half of the boys born in this village didn't live to see 20.
If you survived childhood, if you made it to adulthood, you were incredibly lucky. But what kind of adulthood was it? The average male life expectancy was just 32.
I want you to just let that sink in. Think of everything you have done since you were 32. Or if you aren't 32 yet, imagine your life essentially concluding at that age. And furthermore, the social structure created another deeply hidden nightmare.
Oh, this part is incredibly bleak.
Female infanticide was rampant among the poor because families simply couldn't afford to pay dowries to marry their daughters off. Add to that the practice of polygamy among the wealthy elites who hoarded multiple wives and concubines.
What is the mathematical result of those two factors?
A severe, terrifying shortage of marriageable women for the lower classes.
Legions of men were forced to die entirely alone. They had no land to farm, they had no wives to comfort them, they had no children to honor them after death, in a society where Confucian ancestor worship was everything. If you didn't have a son to burn incense for you, your soul was a hungry ghost.
They were completely alienated from the core purpose of their own culture. This suppressed, miserable underclass of young, unmarried, landless men became the most unstable, explosive powder keg in the empire.
Millions of desperate men with absolutely nothing to lose, just wandering the empire, waiting for a spark.
And while the empire is quietly rotting from the inside, a knock comes at the front door. the twilight knock of an obsolete battleship.
The year is 1793. The Macartney embassy arrives from Great Britain.
Lord Macartney comes offering trade, advanced technology, and a modern diplomatic relationship. But there's a famous diplomatic incident. He refuses to perform the traditional 3 kneelings and 9 kowtows to the emperor.
Right, the famous refusal. Was the British envoy refusing to kowtow really just Western arrogance?
Everyone plays it off as a cultural clash. 2 proud civilizations stubbornly refusing to understand each other. Emperor Qianlong famously haughtily tells the British king in an edict, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious and have no use for your country's manufactures."
He literally said, "There is nothing you have that we need. We are the center of the world. We are self-sufficient."
But you have to look at Macartney's true, chilling observation from his private diary.
Macartney wasn't just annoyed by the kowtow. He was a shrewd observer. He was analyzing the empire's structural integrity.
He didn't see a mighty sleeping dragon.
He wrote that the Qing Empire was an obsolete, crazy, first-rate man of war.
A giant, rotting wooden warship.
It stayed afloat only because of able officers. The sheer momentum of its past greatness kept it moving forward.
But Macartney noted this explicitly. Once a weak captain takes the helm, it will smash to pieces on the shore. It will never survive a storm.
He saw the hollow disease. He saw the involution. He saw a system utterly incapable of adapting to a changing global reality.
The British left empty-handed, but they knew the giant was incredibly vulnerable. And a few decades later, they found the perfect weapon to crack it open.
Which brings us to opium, the silver shortage, and the sovereign crisis.
Was the Opium War really just a moral crusade against a drug?
That is the comfortable narrative we are often taught. The righteous Chinese official fighting the evil, greedy, foreign drug pushers.
In the early 19th century, opium addiction sweeps the nation. It is a massive social catastrophe. It ruins families. But more importantly for the imperial court, it causes massive silver outflows. The global arbitrage is suddenly reversed.
Silver is now pouring out of China to pay the British for the drugs. The economy is destabilizing again, just like it did at the end of the Ming.
The emperor is panicking. He sends his best incorruptible official, Commissioner Lin Zexu, to Guangdong. Lin bans the drug, destroys massive stockpiles of opium right on the beach, and locks up the British merchants in their factories.
But we have to look at the counterintuitive truth here.
To the British merchants and politicians, this had absolutely nothing to do with morality.
It was purely an international balance of payments issue.
They were buying too much Chinese tea and silk. The British public was addicted to tea. Silver was draining from London to Beijing. They desperately needed something the Chinese would buy in massive quantities to balance the ledger. Opium was just a commodity to them, a line item on a spreadsheet.
And more sinisterly, Lin Zexu's righteous, moral crackdown was exactly what the British hawks wanted.
It was the perfect excuse, the ultimate pretext to launch a war.
They used the imprisonment of British subjects and the destruction of private property to demand massive indemnities. They wanted to force open the ports to free trade.
And to steal a barren rock called Hong Kong, they used moral outrage to execute a coldly calculated economic invasion.
And how did they win that war so easily? It wasn't just better military tactics. It was a completely different era of physics.
This is the cross-ocean downgrade strike. How did a single iron ship with a 5-foot draft completely destroy a 10,000-mile coastal defense network?
We are talking about the British ship, the Nemesis.
It sounds like a monster from a myth, but it was just cold, hard industrial engineering.
It had an iron hull, 6 massive steam boilers, and crucially, a draft of only 5 feet. It barely sat in the water.
Explain the utter technological mismatch here. Because the king had massive coastal forts, they had thousands of traditional wooden ships, they had massive numbers of troops.
But the Nemesis didn't care about the wind, it didn't care about the tide, it was independent of nature.
Wow, it could roam freely in shallow coastal waters and narrow rivers where traditional deep-water warships would instantly run aground.
It was a highly mobile, heavily armed fortress that could literally sail upriver against the current, wait for the wind to die so the Chinese sailing ships were immobilized, and then bombard cities at will.
But I want to be fair here. Didn't the Qing army try to catch up? Didn't they see this monster and try to adapt?
They did. They tried desperately. They even managed to capture and copy a 30-gun British warship. They built it out of wood.
But here is the tragedy of it.
A wooden sailing ship against steam power and iron is a total generational gap in physics. It's like bringing a very nice polished sword to a machine gun fight. The outcome is predetermined.
The British didn't even need to defeat the whole Chinese army in a pitched battle. They used their steamships to easily block the Grand Canal.
The economic jugular of the empire.
They blocked the Yangtze River. The empire was instantly choked out.
No grain moving north to feed Beijing, no tax silver moving to the capital. The empire was starved into submission and forced to sign humiliating, unequal treaties.
The grand illusion of invincibility was permanently shattered, and when the center is proven weak, the periphery explodes.
Which brings us to the bloodiest civil war in human history, the utopian illusion of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom.
The powder keg of Dai village, all those desperate, landless men we talked about, finally goes off. But how did a movement promising a heavenly paradise of perfect equality become a terrifying, ascetic concentration camp?
It starts with Hong Yuquan. He is a repeatedly failed scholar who suffers a nervous breakdown, reads a Christian pamphlet, and genuinely believes he is the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He launches the Taiping Rebellion.
He creates something called the Heavenly Land System. The promise to the peasants is incredibly intoxicating. Equal land distribution for everyone. No more rich landlords. No more starving tenants. Everyone shares everything.
They capture massive cities. They confiscate massive amounts of wealth. Over 18 million taels of silver are dumped into a central heavenly treasury.
On paper, it sounds like a perfect egalitarian utopia, centuries ahead of its time.
But the reality was incredibly dark.
All production had to be turned over to the state. You owned absolutely nothing. Not your land, not your tools, not the food you grew.
Hong enforced extreme asceticism.
There was strict segregation of men and women. Even husbands and wives were forcibly separated into different residential camps.
Yeah.
If you were caught visiting your own wife, you could be executed.
It wasn't a paradise. It was a bizarre, brutal, totalitarian military rule.
I think of it like an extreme modern cult compound, but scaled up to rule tens of millions of people. It completely severed the people from their traditional economic and social life. You couldn't trade, you couldn't farm for your family, you were just a biological cog in a holy war machine.
When the Taiping captured the great southern capital of Nanjing, the sophisticated citizens there were horrified.
They felt these native Chinese rebels were as alien and bizarre as the foreigners or the Manchus. They claimed to be destroying the corrupt culture to save the people, but they ended up just destroying the people.
Tens of millions died in the crossfire. The Qing Empire barely survived. And they only survived by relying on local Han militias, finally decentralizing military power. The Central Imperial Army was totally useless.
So after nearly losing everything to peasants and foreigners, the elites finally wake up. They realize they desperately need to modernize. This is the self-strengthening movement.
They bought the most advanced Western weapons. They built massive shipyards and arsenals. So why did they suffer a humiliating slaughter by a much smaller Japan in 1895?
Thinkers like Feng Guifeng say, learn from the barbarians to control them.
Leaders like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang actually execute the vision. They spend millions, they buy machines from Germany and Britain, they build steamboats, they translate Western science and engineering texts.
They are trying to frantically upgrade that rotting battleship McCartney saw.
But here is the fatal flaw. They trap themselves in an ideological straitjacket, a concept known as Zhongtixiong.
Chinese learning for substance, Western learning for application.
They fundamentally believed they could bolt a high-pressure steam engine onto an ancient Confucian bureaucracy.
They completely refused to change their institutional inertia. They thought technology was just a sterile tool, completely independent of the dynamic, messy, capitalist society that actually created it.
And here is the outrageous detail that proves the rot was absolutely terminal.
The marble boat.
They literally diverted vital naval funds money, specifically meant to buy modern warships and ammunition, to defend the coast against Japan, to build a massive, immovable marble boat for Empress Dowager Stixie's summer palace.
A literal stone boat. A monument to imperial vanity. While the Japanese are obsessively building a modern, lethal, disciplined navy.
Without changing the core political system, without rooting out the deep structural corruption, technology was just a useless, expensive decoration.
And when the modern Japanese navy utterly annihilated the Chinese fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River, the illusion was finally, brutally over. You cannot fake modernity.
The physical defeat by a former tributary state triggered a complete psychological collapse among the intellectuals, and it forced a painful rebirth.
Which brings us to the painful awakening in the Iron House. Why did intellectual giants like Liang Kikao and Lu Xun suddenly abandon the dream of building a Spartan, militarized nation?
After the defeat by Japan, the panic is absolute. The intellectual Yan Fu translates a book called Evolution and Ethics. He introduces social Darwinism to the Chinese mind.
Survival of the fittest. The message is stark and clear. Adapt or go extinct as a race. The pressure on the Chinese mind is crushing. They think they just need more guns, more discipline.
But look at Lu Xun's turning point. It is one of the most famous and pivotal moments in modern Chinese history.
Lu Xun is in Japan, studying Western medicine. He truly believes that curing the weak physical bodies of his countrymen is the path to national strength.
He watches a news slideshow after class. It shows a Chinese man about to be executed by the Japanese military for allegedly spying for Russia during the Russo-Japanese War.
But it's not the brutal execution that breaks Lu Xun's heart.
It's the crowd in the background of the photo.
A crowd of strong, physically healthy Chinese people standing around apathetically watching a fellow citizen being slaughtered. Blank expressions, no outrage, no unity, just dull curiosity.
He realizes in a flash of horror, curing bodies means absolutely nothing if the soul is dead. If the people are spiritually numb, perfectly healthy bodies will just make perfectly healthy execution fodder.
He immediately quits medicine. He chooses literature. He realizes he needs to wake up the minds of the people before he worries about their bodies.
The shift is profound across the intellectual landscape. Liang Kikao, another giant, once preached for a ruthless, iron-fisted leader to forge a strong military state, like Bismarck in Germany.
But Liang travels to Europe and despairs after seeing the mechanized slaughter of World War I. He looks at the trenches and realizes Western militarism is just a senseless meat grinder.
Lu Xun famously compares China to an iron house without windows, where the people are fast asleep, rapidly running out of oxygen, about to suffocate in their sleep.
He asks a terrifying question. Do you wake them up so they feel the agonizing pain of dying? Or do you let them die peacefully in their sleep? Lu Xun chooses to wake them up. He famously says, "Hope is like a path in the countryside. Originally there was no path, but once people begin to pass, a way appears."
They realize that without independent, conscious, engaged citizens, a strong military is a dangerous delusion. You cannot build a modern state with a population of sleeping subjects.
The mindset had finally shifted. The blueprint was being rewritten. But for the Qing dynasty, it was far too late. Which brings us to the final collapse. The unfinished search and history repeating.
We reach the end of the line, the final, fatal mistake. And it ironically comes from a surprisingly modern attempt at policy.
How did a court's good intention to buy back railway rights become the final straw that killed the empire?
It's May 1911. The Qing court issues an edict to nationalize the railways.
They want to use massive foreign loans to buy back the railway rights from local provincial investors. Their stated goal was economic development and administrative unity.
It actually makes sense on a macroeconomic level.
Yeah.
A modern state needs a unified, centrally controlled rail network for defense and trade, not a chaotic patchwork of local tracks with different gauges.
Yeah. But the catastrophic backfire, they completely ignored local provincial interests. They ignored the highly sensitive public opinion that deeply hated relying on foreign loans.
The local elites, the wealthy merchants, the gentry, they had patriotically invested their own private money in these railways to keep them out of foreign hands. The government was effectively confiscating their wealth and handing control right back to foreign banks.
This violently enraged local private capital. The very people who usually supported the stability of the state were now its enemies. It instantly ignited the railway protection movement, which rapidly became the 1911 revolution.
The protests morphed into armed rebellion. The modern, Western-trained military mutinied against the throne.
By 1912, the emperor abdicated. The 2,000-year imperial system was dead, brought down by a railway contract dispute.
Let's bring all the massive threads we've covered today together. It wasn't just the railways that killed them.
It was 400 years of institutional inertia, centralizing power so completely that local society couldn't breathe or adapt to a crisis.
It was relentless population pressure leading to desperate, grinding involution. Millions working harder just to starve.
It was deep diplomatic ignorance, sitting in a palace believing you possess all things while iron steamships are entering your shallow waters.
The empire collapsed not just from foreign guns, but from its complete inability to restructure its own internal logic.
Look at the patterns we just exposed today. Think about how they apply right now. Massive technology adoption without any real systemic change. Wealthy elites hiding their money while the middle class is crushed by the treadmill of involution. information bubbles convincing leadership they are invincible right up until the moment the doors are kicked in.
We look back at the Qing dynasty and shake our heads. We think, how could they be so utterly blind to their own demise?
But I want you to think about your own industry. Think about our modern global systems today. Look at the wealth gaps. Look at the institutional paralysis.
Yeah.
Are we actually driving a new path forward? Or are we just the crew on an obsolete, crazy, first-rate man of war waiting to smash against the shore?
The search for modernity doesn't end just because you finally acquire the technology. The search is the constant, painful adaptation of the system itself.
Keep questioning the narratives around you. Look for the hollow disease beneath the prosperity. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material with us. We will catch you on the next one.